The sheriff had grown older, not just in years, but in rhythm. The way he walked, the way he poured his coffee, the way he sat behind the same oak desk and watched the same morning light bend across the warped wooden floorboards of his office, all of it moved slower now. It had been 30 years since anyone had drawn a gun in his town. 30 years without a robbery, a brawl, or even a raised voice at the saloon. Some called it peace. Others, a kind of death with open eyes. He arrived every morning just after 6. His boots tapped against the dusty boardwalk, always at the same pace, as if the ground had memorized his steps. He'd unlock the sheriff's office, push the door that creaked no matter how much oil he used, and step into the silence. On the far wall hung a faded map, its edges curled inward like tired hands. Below it, a locked cabinet mostly empty now, and above it, a clock that ticked a little slower than time itself. He'd set his hat down on the same hook. The tin star he once wore proudly was now tucked in a drawer, dulled and forgotten, much like his badge's authority. The desk drawer on the right contained a bottle he hadn't touched in years, and a set of keys he no longer remembered what they opened. The townsfolk didn't fear him anymore. They greeted him kindly, respectfully, but not with the reverence of old. To the younger generation, he was more a fixture than a figure. Like the church bell that never rang or the old well that no one used. Sheriffin' must be the easiest job in the world, they'd joke. Ain't even got a paper to write on, but he knew better. He knew silence could lie. He knew peace had a price, and often a debt unpaid. Each day followed the same choreography. He'd brew his coffee black, burnt, comforting. Then he'd sit by the window, looking out across the town square. The same hitching post, the same windmill with one broken blade, the same bench where old Martha used to sell hand-sewn aprons until she passed. Nothing changed. Nothing ever did. But still he waited. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the memory of a voice deep, ragged, trembling. With time whispered to him, "One day, they'll all come back. You'll see. And when they do, you better remember who you were." He never told anyone, but in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, beneath old newspapers and forgotten reports, lay a folder. No label, just 20 sheets of yellowed paper. Each with a name. Each name once shouted in the courtroom. Each name once chained and sent away. All of them gone, disappeared without a trace. No death certificates, no parole records. Just vanished. Sometimes late at night, he would dream of footsteps. Slow, synchronized, heavy with dust and distance. He'd hear boots approaching on gravel, feel the weight of judgment in the air. He'd wake up sweating, reaching for a gun that wasn't loaded, heart thudding like an old war drum. But in the morning, the dream would fade. He would wash his face, tighten his belt, and return to his post. To the silence. To the waiting dot. It wasn't boredom that kept him going. It wasn't duty either. It was something else, something older than justice. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the need for closure. Or maybe, deep down, the sheriff understood a truth the town had long forgotten. That silence isn't always peace. Sometimes, it's the breath drawn before the storm dot, and so he sat there again. 30 years after his last arrest, he still wore the same boots, sat in the same chair, and looked out the same window, watching, listening, waiting. Because even after all this time, he still believed someone was coming. There was a drawer beneath the sheriff's desk, worn smooth by decades of reaching hands and the slow erosion of silence. It didn't creak when open, because it rarely ever was. Its key, small and rust-stained, hung beneath his shirt like a charm no one knew he carried. Most who visited that quiet office never even noticed it. To them, the desk was just wood. To him, it was memory. Inside the drawer were no weapons, no documents of current importance, just one folder. Thick, yellowed, and tied shut with a strip of faded red cloth. On its front, Nothing but a smudged fingerprint and a number written. In ink that had begun to vanish. 2020 names. He hadn't added to the file in decades. He hadn't needed to. Everything he needed to remember was already written. Handwritten notes, old mugshots, booking papers all stacked neatly, silently. Each file was dated from the same year, the same month, even the same week. A season of sudden justice. A time when the town was different, louder, sharper. Back when he was younger and less afraid of certainty, he remembered each of them. Not just the crimes which ranged from theft to murder, but the eyes. Some had begged, some had threatened. But most, by the time they were loaded into the wagon, simply stared at him as if they already knew something he didn't, that they would come back. Each year, around the same date, just before the autumn. Winds arrived and painted the streets with gold and rust. He'd take out the folder, light a lamp, close the shutters, and read through a name. Just one, no more. He never rushed. He wanted the memory to settle, to breathe, to speak. 1 year. It was Carter Mays, arrested for robbing a church offering box and stabbing the priest who tried to stop him. His file smelled faintly of mold and candle wax. Another year. It was Jonah Griggs. Cattle thief, 3 counts. Shot a rancher's dog just to make a point. His mugshot had a tear in the corner, right through his left eye. Then there was Delilah Boone, the only woman in the list. Poisoned her employer. No remorse. Her handwriting, scrawled in the margins of her own statement, said, "I only gave what was deserved." No one in town remembered them anymore. Not the children playing marbles near the well, not the men playing cards at dusk. The sheriff never brought them up. It wasn't necessary. Some things were better left resting. But deep inside, he never believed they were truly gone. Not buried. Not forgiven. Just waiting. And the strangest part, the thing he never told a soul, was what happened to the records. After the trials, after the wagons rolled out east, the state prison wrote once, confirming their arrival. After that, nothing. No follow-ups, no paroles, no deaths, no letters from families. It was as if 20 people had been swallowed whole. By time. And now, every time he opened that drawer, something shifted. A whisper in the wood. A tightening in his chest. A chill that didn't come from the weather. He wondered if he'd missed something all those years ago. If the judge's voice had cracked while reading the verdicts. If the chains were too tight. If guilt had warped justice in ways he hadn't noticed. He folded the last file shut and looked at the photo tacked to the wall behind his desk. It was old, black and white, grainy. The 20 prisoners lined up, shackled, staring at the camera with expressions that didn't match the crimes. Most looked tired, resigned. A few, almost amused. But what always unsettled him was the empty space at the far right, a space meant for someone who never showed. The space stayed blank, like the story wasn't over, and in that silence, the sheriff would return the folder to its place, lock the drawer, pour a new cup of coffee with steady hands, and look out the window with eyes that knew how to wait, because the past doesn't stay buried, not forever. The morning unfolded as all the others had before it. In a town too small for secrets and too quiet for legends, the sheriff unlocked his office with the same key he'd used for over 25 years. Dust floated in the angled morning sun like old ghosts still unsure of where they belonged. He poured his coffee black, no sugar, the way his father used to drink it, and sat in the same leather chair that groaned under his weight like it, too, remembered when there used to be noise. In this place, across the street, the saloon stood shuttered. The blacksmith's forge hadn't been lit in a decade. Kids had grown and left, and those who stayed learned not to ask why the sheriff kept showing up to work in a town with no crime. And then, it happened. The bell over the cafe door didn't ring. The dogs didn't bark. No horse whinnied. But still, someone was there. At the far edge of town, just past the ridge, where the fence leaned too far and no one ever fixed it, a man appeared. Not in a rush, not lost. Just walking like he'd never stopped. He wore a hat pulled low, not to hide his face, but to keep the sun from drawing attention to the scars. His boots struck the earth with the rhythm of memory, the kind of gait that didn't ask permission to return. He walked with the heavy silence of someone who had left something behind and come back for it. The sheriff stood at the window, coffee forgotten. He didn't touch the gun on his hip. He didn't open the door. He just watched. Because sometimes when the past comes back, it doesn't knock. It just walks in. The man crossed the main street, stepped into the market. He didn't look around, didn't ask for anything. Bought a loaf of bread, a small tin of beans, and a box of matches. Said thank you and left. No one spoke to him. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know what to say. The town didn't have words for men like that anymore. Climbed the steps of the old boarding house. It had been empty for years. No guests, no keeper. But the door creaked open anyway, and the man disappeared inside. The sheriff exhaled. It felt like he'd been holding that breath since the man first appeared. He walked to his desk, pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside, under the yellowed newspaper clippings and faded arrest reports, were 20 folders. Names written in longhand. Dates that no longer made sense to the young. But he remembered. The top file read, Elliot Drake, armed robbery, 15 years. Vanished post-release. But he hadn't vanished. He just waited. Somewhere. And now he was back. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, moving the warm air in a circle that had no beginning and no end. He didn't know why. Elliot had come back, but he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The street outside remained quiet. But in the distance, maybe only in his mind, the sheriff heard it. Footsteps. More of them. And behind his eyes, 20 faces stirred. It started with one man, then another, and another. By noon that day, the sheriff had stopped pretending it was coincidence. Every hour, almost like clockwork, a figure would appear at the edge of town. They didn't come in a group, didn't arrive by train or horse. Each came on foot, alone, silent, their faces worn by time, sun, and regret. But there was something in the way they moved, something too steady to be accidental. At 8 a.m., the second man came. A tall figure with a crooked shoulder and a limp that whispered of old bar fights and broken bones. He nodded once to the townsfolk and disappeared into the shadows of the old hotel, like he already knew which room had been waiting for him. At 9, the third appeared. A shorter man, cleaner somehow, as if the years had been gentler on him, but his eyes betrayed the same distance. He didn't look around, didn't wave. Just walked past the church, past the saloon, and vanished into the alley that ran behind the old jailhouse. At 10, another. Then 11. Then noon. By 1 p.m., the sheriff stood at the window with the ledger open in front of him. His hands shook slightly. Not with fear, but with memory. Each face, each silhouette, had once stood in his office, shackled, defiant, or broken, or silent. Some had screamed, some had cried, some had said nothing at all, but they had all sworn they'd never come back. And yet here they were. He flipped to the next page in the drawer. The names were written in the same hand as hand from decades ago. His notes were sparse, but the words still bit. Carmelo Tate, arson. Released 1994. Harvey Klein, assault. Released 1993. Julio Reams, burglary. Escaped 1995. The sheriff looked at the clock. 1:58, and at 2 p.m. sharp, another one came. This one walked slower, heavier, as if each step was paid for in guilt. He paused at the edge of Main Street and looked toward the sheriff's office, not with defiance, not with shame, but with something in between. Recognition, maybe. Resignation. The sheriff didn't wave, didn't blink. The man moved on. Behind the sheriff, the office felt smaller, the air denser. as if the building itself remembered the weight of justice or the illusion of it. By 5 p.m., there were 10. All staying in different corners of the town. None of them spoke to one another. None of them visited the cemetery or the church. They didn't ask about the sheriff. And they didn't knock on any doors. They simply arrived each hour, each minute, as if responding to a call no one else could hear. Some folks in town started whispering. They came back. For what? For him, someone said. At 6 p.m., a boy no older than 12 rode his bike past the boarding house. He said he saw 3 of them sitting on the porch, not talking, just staring into the dusk. The sheriff watched from his window as the sun dipped low, turning the sky into something between blood and fire. The kind of color that made you remember things you tried to forget. He reached into his drawer again and pulled out the bottom file, the last one. The one with no photo, just a name, Victor Halle, attempted murder. Disappeared after release. The sheriff didn't know what time Victor would show, but he felt it in his bones he would come. And when he did, the clock in the town square would stop, because this wasn't a reunion. It was something else. Something that had waited years to arrive. They came as if they had never left. All 20. By dusk, every one of them had gathered, not in the streets, not in the square, but in the one place that time seemed to have skipped. The old saloon at the center of town. The same crooked porch. The same peeling sign. Inside, dust hovered in the air like it was holding its breath, waiting to remember. And the men, those 2 decades older shadows of former selves, walked through the swinging doors without looking at each other. They didn't nod. They didn't smile. Each one went to a different seat. But those who remembered knew those were the same seats they had taken the night before the arrest. The night everything had come undone. The saloon was empty, save for the barman. He didn't speak, didn't pour. He watched them settle in, his hands resting on the worn mahogany bar, his breath caught in his throat. One by one, they sat. Same chairs, same table layout, same hush. It was a ritual, though none would call it that. A memory echoing itself into flesh again. Outside, the sheriff stayed inside his office. He hadn't left since the first one arrived. Hadn't eaten. Barely moved, but on the table before him, a leather-bound notebook lay open. Yellowed pages cracked. Spine. The ink on the front had faded, but he didn't need it to read what it said. The 20, it wasn't an official record. No badge number, no court seals. Just his own hand, his own words. Notes that he wrote late at night when he couldn't sleep, about them, who they were, what they did, what they didn't do, what he couldn't prove, and something else. Each page ended with a question. Not about the crime, not about the punishment, but about the moment he couldn't forget. The one thing they all said, whispered, or implied in different ways. This isn't over. And now here they were, back in the same place, sitting in the same silence, not looking for revenge, not asking for anything, just ... Being there. Inside the saloon, the air turned thick. The barman slowly reached below the counter and pulled out an old bottle, the one that had gathered dust since the day the arrests were made. He poured one glass. No one moved to take it. At 9:14 p.m., the wind outside stopped. The sheriff didn't get up, but he flipped to the last page in his notebook. There was no name, just a line. When they return, I'll know the truth. In the saloon, no one moved. But the barman swore later that the chairs made a sound, all at once. Not like someone stood up, but like the room itself shifted, and above them, on the wall, a photograph that hadn't been there before. A group picture, taken 20 years ago. All of them were in it. The sheriff too, young, serious, unaware, but someone had circled a face in red ink. It was the only one smiling. The sheriff didn't sleep that night, didn't move much. Just sat behind his desk, the old files spread out before him like paper ghosts. Yellow folders, creased and fragile, still marked with pencil lines that had grown faint over time. He'd opened each one 1,000 times before, but this time was different. His hands moved slower. His eyes saw more. On the left corner of every file, under the faded mugshots and brittle paperwork, he noticed something he hadn't in years. A mark, a barely visible line, red, under each name. 20 of them, all arrested on the same night. All for different reasons, or so it had seemed. He began reading aloud, name by name. Not to anyone, not even to himself, just to the silence. And that silence responded with memory. One name, then another. Then another. All came back, not just as facts, but as people. He remembered the way one laughed, even in cuffs. The way another didn't flinch when the cell door closed. The way one of them, barely 18, whispered something as he passed the sheriff in the hallway. You don't know what you stopped. He never figured out what that meant. Not back then. Not in the trial, not in the appeals. And now, all these years later, that whisper clawed its way back from the walls of his memory. The sheriff spread the files across the table, side by side. A timeline written in mugshots and ink. There, between the arrest dates and court transcripts, a pattern emerged. It wasn't what they had done, it was when. The night of the Great Fire. A fire that had taken half the town. A fire that no one could explain. A fire that they were blamed for, even though not one charge stuck. Arson wasn't proven, but their names stayed dirty. Their lives never quite returned, and then they disappeared. Moved out, vanished. Some said the sheriff exiled them. Some said they left on their own. But none of that mattered now, because they had returned, quietly, without anger, without accusation. Just 20 men, walking the same streets, sitting in the same chairs, saying nothing. But what the files didn't explain, what no report or transcript could account for, was why they all came back now. Why on the same day? Why at the same hour? Why without a word? The sheriff leaned back, his chair creaking like a tired confession. He stared at the wall, at the old town map. He had drawn a red circle on it once, around the fire's origin point. A house long gone. And now, in his mind, another circle began to form not on the map, but around the names. A connection unspoken, as if they had been marked by something older than justice, older than guilt, maybe not cursed, maybe chosen. He opened the bottom drawer, pulled out a box. Inside, an old lighter, warped by heat, found at the fire site. Never claimed, never mentioned in court. He held it now, weighing it in his hand like a memory made metal. And on its base, a name was scratched, not one of the 20, his own. It was well past midnight when the lights inside the old saloon flickered and died. Not with a spark or a sound, just a soft breath of extinguishing, like someone had exhaled against the flame of the past. The barkeep froze with a glass in hand. But the 20 men did not. They stood in unison, as if signaled by a silence older than the town itself. No words passed between them, only the slow shuffle of boots on floorboards, and then the long creak of the swinging doors as they stepped outside, one by one, into the cold night. The sheriff, watching from his office window, had been waiting for something. He didn't know what, but he felt it in his chest like an ache. He grabbed his coat, left his coffee steaming on the desk, and followed. The town was quiet, not in the way all towns are at night, but in the way a theater falls silent just before the curtain lifts. The 20 men moved through the empty streets, with a rhythm that seemed practiced, purposeful. They walked past the general store, the church, the shuttered barber shop. And then, they turned toward the center of town, the old square. Once, 30 years ago, that square had been the heart of the town. Now it was just a cracked expanse of stone and ash, long since cleared of rubble, but never rebuilt. The place where the fire had started, where lives had ended, where nothing ever grew again. The sheriff's boots echoed behind them, his pace slower, unsure. He stopped at the edge of the square, watching the men form a loose circle where the old well used to be. None of them looked at him. They stood in silence, facing inward, their faces lit by moonlight, their expressions unreadable. Then one of them stepped forward, a man the sheriff only vaguely remembered from the files. Scar on his cheek, name long forgotten, and knelt, not in pain, not in reverence, just ... returned. And one by one, the others did the same. The sheriff's breath caught, because the shape they formed on the cracked earth mirrored something he had once sketched on a page during those endless nights of review and regret. A symbol found carved into a cellar door beneath the house where the fire had begun. He'd never understood it. No one had. The court had dismissed it as graffiti, but it had haunted him. And now here it was again, drawn not in chalk or ash, but in people, in presence, in penance. One of the men stood and faced him. The sheriff didn't flinch. The man said nothing, only reached into his coat and pulled out a charred photograph. Brittle at the edges, he handed it to the sheriff. It was the same photo that had once hung in the town hall of the old founders, the square behind them, smiling with pride. Except this version had something the original never did. In the background, faint but unmistakable, were 20 figures, barely visible ... watching, always watching. The sheriff looked up, eyes wide, but the man had turned back. No one else moved. He clutched the photo tighter. The square smelled faintly of smoke, as if memory had a scent. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't a haunting. It was a homecoming. The moon had begun its slow descent when the sheriff stood at the edge of the square, the photograph still clutched in his hand, brittle and cold. The men had not moved. They stood like statues cast from the past, their shadows long across the cracked stone. The sheriff didn't step forward. Not at first. He lingered on the threshold of memory, unsure if he was welcome in the circle of silence that had formed without his consent. He had always been the keeper of order, the voice of finality, the hand that locked the cells. But tonight, he was none of those things. He was just a man with too many questions and not enough years left for answers. Slowly, as if pulled by a thread, he walked forward, boots scuffing the dust, eyes not meeting theirs. He moved toward the well, now just a ring of blackened stone, and paused beside the man who had handed him the photograph. The man did not look at him. None of them did. That was part of it. The price, the reckoning. For years he had kept there. Names in a drawer, locked away like secrets he didn't want to unpack. He'd told himself they were criminals, that justice had been served, that the fire had been their fault, or at least, that's what he let the court believe. But he had known then, as he knew now, that justice had not been the same for all of them. Not that night, not in that town. There had been panic. There had been pressure. There had been the need for someone to blame. 20 men had been enough. 20 had silenced the voices of the town. 20 names had fit neatly on a single sheet. He remembered the hearings, brief and hurried. He remembered the smoke still, rising when the trials began. And he remembered the one face he didn't know which who had looked at him through the bars and said nothing, just stared. The same way they were staring now. Not with anger, not with hope, just silence. The sheriff felt it settle on his shoulders like dust, like years. He took off his hat, slowly, deliberately. The wind moved through his thinning hair. He looked down at the ground, then placed the hat gently beside his boot. It was a gesture, not an answer. A confession, not in words, but in posture. Around him, the men did not speak. They did not move. But something in the air shifted, like the weight of judgment had passed. The sheriff closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 decades, he let himself wonder. Had they all been guilty? Had any of them? He would never know. But maybe they did. Maybe that's why they'd come back, not for revenge, but for recognition. To be seen again, even if only once, as something more than a record in a drawer. And in that stillness, surrounded by ghosts who were somehow more alive than most of the living he'd known, the sheriff felt it, something loosening in his chest. A tightness he'd carried for too long. The night held them all in a still breath. No forgiveness, no verdict. Just the truth, unspoken, shared. The sun rose slow and muted over the town of Elkhorn, casting a pale light across the dust-laced rooftops, as if even the sky was unsure whether morning had truly come. The streets remained silent, more silent than usual, not the kind of stillness that came from sleep, but the kind left behind after something had passed through, something heavy. The townsfolk awoke one by one, stepping onto porches with coffee in hand, rubbing the blur of sleep from their eyes. No one spoke, but they felt it, an absence they couldn't name, a hush that wrapped around the buildings like early fog. It was only when a young boy, no older than 10, wandered toward the square, chasing a loose chicken, that someone noticed. The well at the center of the town was still, the benches empty, but the old saloon door stood half open, swinging gently, as though recently touched. No wind, no footprints, but something had moved through. Inside the saloon, the dust hadn't settled. The floorboards, usually cold to the touch, held the faintest whisper of heat. And in the dim light filtering through the warped glass windows, 20 chairs stood arranged in a loose circle, none perfectly aligned, each worn at the edges, the kind of wear that only comes from waiting. On every seat, the leather still warm. The bartender came in next, hat in hand, pausing at the threshold. He hadn't opened the place in weeks. There'd been no need. Yet everything looked occupied. The scent of old tobacco hung in the air, mingled with something else, char, maybe, or ash, like the ghost of an extinguished fire. On the floor near the bar, a dark shape caught the light. It was the sheriff's hat, brimmed down, just as he had placed it. No note, no boots beside it. Just the hat, and a stillness that seemed to watch from every corner. Word spread quickly, though no one really said it aloud. The sheriff was gone. The men were gone. And yet, no one reported anything missing. No doors were broken. No one had heard horses. No sounds in the night. Just that peculiar stillness that lingered long after it should have moved on. Some said they saw faint shapes leaving the town before sunrise, shadows without forms, men without footsteps. Others claimed the wind spoke names they hadn't heard in 30 years. But when the townsfolk gathered at noon, no one questioned the sheriff's absence. The hat remained untouched. The saloon, though warmed by ghosts, stayed empty. In that moment, the townspeople didn't feel fear. What they felt was older than fear. It was reverence. As if something had concluded that wasn't meant for them to understand. Just outside the saloon, etched lightly in the wood of the porch beam, someone had carved a single line. No one saw it being written, yet there it was. Justice returns in silence. And beneath it, the date exactly 30 years after the fire. The sheriff did not unlock the jail that morning. He did not pour his coffee into the same chipped mug, nor did he check the empty bulletin board for complaints that never came. Instead, he arrived early, long before the town had stirred his boots. Slow against the wooden steps of the old sheriff's office, the hinges of the door groaning one last time behind him. There was something final in the way he moved, the kind of quiet that follows decisions made deep in the night. He stepped inside, removed his badge, and placed it gently on the desk. The weight of it, brass dulled by decades of touch, seemed heavier now than ever before. And beside it, he left a single note, folded once. On it, in handwriting steadier than expected, just one line. Justice isn't always in the courthouse. Sometimes it comes on foot, late, quiet, and still owed. The office remained empty after that. Hours passed before the first townspeople noticed. And when they stepped inside, no one touched the desk. They only stood in the doorway, reading the note as if it were scripture. No one knew where the sheriff had gone. The roads bore no trace of his passing, but no one searched. No one asked. The town was not afraid. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, a hush fell over Elkhorn. A reverent kind of stillness, different than before. It was the silence of something completed, of debts finally settled. The wind moved softer through the alleyways. The old saloon's porch creaked not in protest, but in rhythm. And the townspeople, young and old, began to walk a little slower past the square, their eyes catching on shadows just a moment longer. From that day on, no one spoke of the 20 men again, but their presence lingered in the warmth of an empty chair, the flicker of a lantern, the silence between conversations. They became part of the town, woven into its rhythm like forgotten verses of an old song. The sheriff's office remained unlocked, untouched, the note untouched, the badge unmoved. And, though Elkhorn remained quiet, it was never the same kind of quiet again. It was a silence that people began to listen to not with suspicion, but with respect. As if they too were waiting for something. Or someone. If you're still here, let me ask you, what time is it where you're watching from? Are you listening? In the dark, or is the sun still up where you are? If this story settled gently on your night, consider supporting us. Like the video, subscribe for more whispered tales, and leave a comment telling us your time zone. It helps us feel a little less alone, because justice, like silence, sometimes echoes longer than a gunshot.